Let's make my builder grade quilt pattern using a layer cake. Layer cakes are 10-inch squares, and for this pattern you will need 40 10-inch squares, yielding a 48-inch by 56-inch quilt. Using 80 10-inch squares will yield a jumbo twin-size quilt measuring at 64 inches by 80 inches, just to give you a few more options. With each layer cake 10-inch square, you will cut one 2.5-inch square, one 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle, one 4.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle, one 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle, and lastly, one 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle. And that's it. You'll just repeat these steps to every single layer cake 10-inch square. Now it is time to mix up your prints in a log cabin-like fashion. Keep the 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle and 4.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle in the same print, as well as the 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle and a 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle in a same matching print but different from all the rest. Then all we have to do is sew everything back together again. First up, we are going to sew the 2.5-inch square to the 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle. Then you will sew the 4.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle to the unit that you just created. Then you will sew the 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle to the unit, and lastly 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle, leaving you with a simple and quick log cabin style block measuring 8.5-inch square. Now all you have to do is repeat this step until you have made enough for the quilt size you've selected. Once all of your blocks are made, you will lay them out in a 6x7 block layout or a 8x7 block layout for the twin size quilt. All you'll have to do is rotate your blocks 90 degrees to give them that ultra scrappy look. Then as always, you will sew your blocks together to form rows, and lastly, sew your rows together to complete your quilt top. And here is what my quilt top looks like all finished. Builder Grade is a great beginner-friendly quilt pattern for those who want to dip their toes into a log cabin style block. And for the backing, I am using a print from within the collection. Then for the thread choice, I am going with glide threads in the color Mocha. And here is what my quilt looks like all quilted. Once again, one layer cake will yield a 48-inch by 56-inch quilt. If you use 2 layer cake bundles and instead make 80 quilt blocks while placing them in a 8x10 block layout, you will yield a twin size quilt measuring 64 inches by 80 inches, just to give you a few more options. But if you could please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can be notified for your next amazing quilt project.